on the housekeeping events before we jump into the Q&A side of things. But so in this particular event, everybody who's a participant will be muted, so you will be unable to ask verbally questions. So therefore, your questions are going to be handled and asked through the QA functionality, which is on the bottom right-hand side, should be of your screen. And it's, in essence, similar to a chat, but it's listed as Q&A. And so you'll be able to ask questions there, and you'll in the All tab, you'll be able to see all the questions that have been asked. And in the My Q&A side of things, you'll be able to see the questions that you particularly asked. So we're going to start with questions that have been submitted online and through the email already, and we'll answer those and go through those first, and we'll see how many we can get to that happen live here through the Q&A. If we don't get to your particular question in the Q&A session that comes through on the Q&A tab, then we will certainly have those documented and answer them and send them back out as making them available for everybody via the website. But this call is going to be recorded, and go ahead, Karen, and start that process now, I guess, so everybody understands that it's being recorded such that all questions and all answers will be made available to all participants. So the recording will be made available up on the website, and then folks who are unable to attend this particular call have the benefit of being able to hear and listen to both the questions that were asked and answers that were provided, such that no particular team or individual reaps any benefits from partiality of being able to attend a particular call. So that will be how we handle question and answers throughout the competition. They'll be submitted, they'll be aggregated, and might not be verbatims, but certainly thematically the questions will be answered on this call or on a biweekly basis starting next week. So that's the kind of the housekeeping side of things. And what we'll end up doing now is I'll stop sharing this screen and then share another kick off the official. So, Karen, can you acknowledge that this is showing up on your screen? That would be great.
Yes, I can see it.
Fantastic. Thank you. So, again, one of the things I wanted to start with today, at least, is to provide some context to. Certainly, I'm not going to go over the eligibility per se or specifically masters enrolled in a master's program is required. You'll see it. There's spans lots of things. Master of Science, Master of Arts. We tried to cover pretty much most master's program. That's pretty much the baseline requirement. Not going to go through all the other eligibility requirements. The rules are up on the website specifically that you can refer to. The one thing I did want to point out, however, is on the right-hand side of this is numbers for this year's competition. When we did this last week, you saw last year's numbers. So, but we have this year's numbers, and so over 1,300 individuals are participating thus far in this competition. That constitutes about 473 teams that have completed, the team sign up and the NDAs and have received, the data that they made every requirement to get the data. So 473 teams representing 81 universities. And obviously there's some universities that have many teams and some many different schools from the same university are all participating here. So this is about close to double, about from where we were last year, which is fantastic, and I'm sure has nothing to do with the bottom circle there about the top prize being $30,000. So everything has stepped up, which is fantastic. We really like to see the numbers has grown as much as they have. So that is fantastic. Moving on. Again, be remiss if we don't cover off on the timeline. Today is the 19th. Obviously, this is the one opportunity that there is to have a phone call with question and answers. That question and answers will continue throughout the competition, and people can submit Q&A through or questions through either the email that is provided, and we'll show you that again in a little bit, and or the FAQ section of the website. And then obviously as questions come in, we'll do our best on a 2 times a week basis. I think it's listed as Tuesdays and Fridays to update that and provide answers to questions that roll in. Again, not every question verbatim per se, but there's a lot of questions that coming from different teams that are the same, in essence, the same question. So hence, we'll call it down and make sure that pretty much every question and what the intent of the question gets answered. Next time, big deadline people can't forget, October 15th. That's when the submission is due back to us, and we'll talk a little bit more about specifically what is due there. And then shortly thereafter, the 21st, we'll have narrowed the field down to the top 50 submissions based off of the holdout file that was provided and performance of individual models based off of that holdout file. That will be how we get down to the top 50 teams. And then that will be announced on the October 21st if you were made that top 50 cut. Then, again, once you make the top 50 cut, then your written submission gets read and judged by the various judges. Multiple judges will read each submission, as mentioned, and we will narrow it down to the top 5 finalists, and the top 5 finalists will be announced on the 28th of October. So that's kind of the timeline of interactions between us and as the hosts of the healthcare case competition and you as the participants. And obviously November 14th, everything culminates with presentations in Houston. So that is the timeline. Always important to keep your focus on that. Probably the next most important thing that I just want to convey quickly before we get into the individual questions is to remind folks a little bit about the things that are in and within the data. And I had this graphic and mentioned it a little bit on the kickoff call last week. I think it probably makes a little bit more sense now after people have had some time to look at the data and immerse themselves in the data. But we have provided through the data, and there are 2 files, one called comp, and that's intended to be the analysis file and competition file that you use to do all your heavy lifting with model development, etc. And then we have a secondary file that's called holdout, which is a file that we expect you to score with your final model and return back to us the requisite information, and we'll cover that again in a few minutes. But in each of those files, it's really set up as a longitudinal perspective of individuals and members and their activities through this 4-year time window, starting in 2015 going through 2018. You are blinded to some extent of the explicitness of what dates the events happened, but we did provide what we are calling an anchor date. And an anchor date, every member in the files have an anchor date, and the anchor date is set to 0. And then, in essence, all the activity of that member before that anchor date and after that anchor date are relative to that. So any event that happens before, in this particular visual example, any event, say this RX claim right here is a first naive opioid that happens in 2016 for this particular member. Hence, they have an anchor date of 0. So these other events that are listed here, a medical claim, they ended up calling in to Humana, another pharmacy claim. They had a hospital event with a new diagnosis, if you will, and then another doctor visit with a subsequent RX. All these things happened on the timeline, but they happened prior to the anchor date. And then the relativity in terms of when did they happen prior to is based off of that field called days. So day 0 is the anchor date, and it's the first opioid naive claim for this particular member in the 2016, which all of them are set that way. First one in 2016, which gives you at least a year's backwards for history perspective, and you can see what happens. And then in this 105, in this particular instance, there happened to be a medical claim and an RX claim on the same date at 105 days prior to this qualifying anchor date. And then again, 175 days from the anchor date, they had this hospital experience with a new diagnosis. So everything is set forth in terms of this anchor date from a timing perspective. So you can understand backwards what happened to the member, and you can understand going forwards what happened to the member. So for instance, here's after the anchor date or the qualifying claim, here they had another medical claim 78 days after that script, qualifying script, and then they had another prescription that happened 125 days. Now, are all of these prescriptions that are listed here opioid prescriptions? No, because we included all prescriptions and medical claims associated with the member across this 4-year time period. I just wanted to provide illustration to some extent about how it works and what the anchor date is. So that was very important that people understand that, and there was some question related to, can you help us understand the anchor date and day 0, if you will. Now, let's continue with this example very briefly. And say this, because there's 2 things that people have to define, obviously, before you can even get to modeling to some extent, and that is, what is a qualifying event or a qualifying claim? What's an opioid-naive type of claim? And so it has to be a pharmacy claim for an opioid, and then one has to end up, and let's say in this particular example, day 0, we'll use it as an example, we end up looking back 90 days and seeing if they had any opioids in their possession within that 90-day time period, and that kind of qualifies that as an opioid naive. If no, then it's a qualified claim, opioid naive, and that's kind of a record eligible for modeling. That's definition number 1. The second definition is the behavior of interest, which is what we're trying to predict is what's the risk of long-term opioid therapy, which has been referenced as LTOT. And again, that's based off, in this particular example, based off of that particular claim, day 0, you're going to fast forward 180 days in the future, so to speak, and see if they meet this definition of continuous use of an opioid medication with 90% days covered over a 6-month time period. So we're calling 180 days 6 months, and it's a pretty explicit definition of what we mean. So when we're talking about defining the behavior of interest and a qualified claim, these are the kind of my explicit, as explicit as I'm going to get, example to how to define that. And Derek and or Ryan and I open it up for you if you wanted to add to that. Otherwise, we can move on to the actual questions. Fair enough. I will continue. So now we'll get into the actual, some questions that have been submitted over since data has been released, and I think data started being released as early as Friday, Saturday of last week, and again, people are more than welcome to continue to submit these. So I've compiled these and kind of classified them into 3 different sections, if you will. And so, again, you might not see your question verbatim, but it should be kind of categorical and helpful for everybody to hear and see these particular questions. So these are more generic competition-related questions. Can we use any program or language in order to complete the analysis? Are there any restrictions on how we do our analysis? And from a prescription of how you do your analysis, absolutely not. You all as analysts can choose your own path and on how you do things and what you do. I will call you to the rules that do list some specific related to tool sets. So SAS is listed in there, but obviously that could be base, that could be enterprise miner, that could be cover a lot of different things. So, but there's generally speaking, it's a pretty wide open field. I think some of the open source things that are in here with R and Python explicitly allows you to open it up and do a lot of different things. So from an analysis perspective, we're not very prescriptive. Now, is the holdout file that I referenced, we provided to comp and holdout, is the holdout file what we're going to be using to judge? And the answer is yes. The holdout file is going to be what we use. And what you provide to us is what we're going to use in round 1 to determine the top 50 entries. So it's very important that you keep that file aside, use the comp file, if you will, to develop and hone and figure out what is your best model that you can come up with from accuracy and prediction. And then once you're done with that development and kind of happy with where it sits, then you apply that model to the holdout file, and you won't be able to determine LTOT within the holdout file because there are no, if I get back to that screen a minute ago, in the LTOT file, I'll shoot up for a minute, there are no dates that are positive in the LTOT file, only dates that are 0 or negative. So you won't be able to, and you need obviously positive dates to be able to determine LTOT. So obviously you won't be able to determine that on the holdout file, and hence that's what we're going to be able to use to score, because obviously we know what happens after day 0 in the holdout file, but we suppress that from you. So absolutely yes, that's the file. And so, again, to be very explicit about what is going to be due on the 15th of October, 2 things, and this is a change from previous years. Previously, we only had the written submission that was what was a summary of your analysis and some of the insights and recommendations, and it was kind of a word write-up. That's still due this year, so that part hasn't changed. But this addition of the holdout file, which you're going to end up applying your best model to, that is a second piece that is necessary to have a complete submission. So what is required on that file that you send back? We don't need the entire file with all of the attributes that were provided. All we need are 3 things, 3 very specific things. The first thing is the ID associated with the record that you are scoring. That is provided in the file. We need that back. Obviously, that's our key for matching LTOT on our side. So we need the ID. We need a predicted value. So your model comes up with a predicted value or predicted score, a p-hat, so to speak, and we need that coming from you as well. So your model says, if I'm person one, that, person one, or in this particular case as an example, comma delimited file, person, this is the ID 1545, they have, their predicted value probability of LTOT is 0.8954. That comes out of your specific algorithm. And that's the highest scoring individual, so they have a rank, an individual rank of 1, if you will. So those are the three fields: the ID, the predicted score that comes out of your algorithm, and then the rank of that particular person or that particular individual. So if there are 6,000 records in the holdout file, you're going to have values in the individual rank of 1 to 6,000. So that's the holdout file and the written submission. Both of those are due on October 15th. Holdout file will be used to determine the top 50 entries. The written submission component is what will be judged in round 2 on completeness of insights and recommendations and kind of implications, kind of the wholeness instead of just model performance. What else can you, how can you help us understand what we're learning from it? So what? That comes from the written submission. And so both of those are the 15th. So I spend a lot of time on this because this is one of the most important things. The PowerPoint for round 3, is that due on the 15th? No, it's not due on the 15th. That PowerPoint, if you make it to the top 5, you'll be notified as stated on the calendar on the 28th, and then at that point in time, you can start putting your presentation together. That will be done on the 14th. So you don't have to do that at the same time, just these two. Again, what analysis are we expected to run on the holdout file? I think I went through this, so I don't necessarily want to spend any more time on it. Score the file with your particular model. Provide us the specific fields in a comma delimited format, and then we will append LTOT and determine performance based off of AUC. So that's the holdout. And then how will the results of this competition be used? And so in essence, we are really hoping that through this effort, the insights that you all generate and the recommendations that you make are what's going to be used, right? And so how can those recommendations and insights be leveraged here at Humana and implemented to reduce the incidence of opioid abuse? So it's really a big part of the competition. Not only is can you build accurate models, but can you help tell a story and come up with something that is useful and for us, and that means you have to do the whole thing, produce the model, come up with the insights, tell us the recommendations for how to use it effectively, et cetera. So those are the specifics related to the competition. We'll move on to some attribute-specific information. Again, you'll get this whole deck, so I'll try to move faster because there's a lot of stuff in here. But one of the biggest questions was kind of delineating and understanding what the difference and definitions are between a payday supply and a payable quantity, both of which are fields that are available on the script side of things within the data for pharmacy events. So a payday supply, again, is just the number of days that of drug units dispensed for the claim. So oftentimes you'll hear this is a 30-day script. That is what payday supply count, how long is the script supposed to last, assuming the member and person takes as prescribed. And then the payable quantity to compare with it is the actual number of drugs or the actual number of things dispensed for the claim. So in the example that I say with you might have a 30-day script, but if, for instance, I am asked, in my script, I'm asked to take it twice a day, then the payable quantity would be 60 because there's actually 60 drugs dispensed in the claim, even though it's going to last me 30 days because I have to take 2 times a day. So that's the primary difference between those two. One is how long, and payday supply is really the key for what many of the things that you have to do here. So, and then MME is in essence a standard scale for opioid prescriptions. So that's what it stands for. The Internet is a beautiful thing for some of these definitions, and I would continue to recommend that for research beyond what is provided by us. I think in some of the pharmacy claim events, there's a drug group ID. So that is just an 11-digit NDC code, which defines, is kind of also out there on the web that you can look up very specific 11-digit NDC codes and understand what it is. But then there is also a longer description similar in one of the attributes that is called a drug group description. So we've kind of done that lookup for you. We provided the NDC IDs and the C codes for you, but if you wanted, you could just look at the description that is in there called drug group description, and that defines kind of what you should see if you were to look up NDC ID or drug group ID in the on the web, if you will. Within inbound call events, and again, there are several different kind of events included in the data. One, and probably the primary and focus, is pharmacy claims. But the secondary is medical claims as a fully paid claim. That's what a medical claim is, and then we have kind of these inbound call type of events, and I think there are three different of those. One called member, which means me as a person who's a member or the patient that's one. So inbound calls by member is I'm calling about my own self. And then there's inbound calls by provider, which are my physician or a provider is calling on my behalf. So that's a difference between by member and by provider. And by other is a third category of inbound call events, and that is could be by a caregiver or somebody who's not the actual member or patient themselves, and or not a provider. So, and then within that, there's a field in one of the attributes called origin, and origin is really a internal system within Humana that. Was it on our legacy system or was it on the newer Salesforce system? And again, legacy is listed as CCP, Salesforce is SFDC. It only has two values, and again, that's what they mean, but probably not very useful in this particular case. There's just information for you. Fully paid claim, as I mentioned, is a medical claim, and other events that are claim-oriented, such as new diagnosis, new provider surgery, are often kind of events that are derived from this fully paid claim. So the fully paid claim is a medical event, and lots of things can be spawned from that, whether, hey, this person has a new diagnosis that they've never had before, or this is a new provider for the member that they used, or this is a surgery-related field, and in some cases, that's the information that you're getting with those events, that it was a new diagnosis. You don't have to go look through all their history to figure out have they ever had this diagnosis before. It's already been done. But again, the information is really, that's just informational. I'd really be focusing on fully paid claim, medical claims, as well as the RX paid claim for pharmacy. And when we get to the pharmacy types, again, here's the different kinds of events. There are paid claims. Again, that's the primary focus. These others, again, especially the latter two, a new drug and first-time mail order, are really just informational fields that spawn from a fully paid claim. So it's like, hey, this is a new drug for this person, and it will spawn an event that is called a new drug. So you could very well see one event that is an RX paid claim, and on the very same day have a new drug and a first-time mail order, meaning they are filling this for the first time in the mail, and it was a new drug for them, and really it all happens and is talking about the same drug itself. You don't add those together by any means. This is the primary one. The others are informational that allows you potentially to create some features off of that, and maybe it's important. A rejected claim is something that at some point in time there was administrative issues or safety issues associated with our RX claim, and again, probably it's just the fact that it happened and when did it happen in terms of relativity. I think that's the type of information that you get. So primary focus again is going to be on these two fully paid claim for medical, RX claim paid for pharmacy. The others are really informational and useful for feature engineering potentially. And then should rejected claims be included in the calculation of LTOT? No. Again, we're really focusing on RX paid claims. And again, MME is one way of identifying, with helping you identify potentially, and then you have to look at, of course, is it naive, et cetera, whether it's a qualifying claim. But moving on. RX costs and net paid amount, again, this is something you learn probably within the payer space. RX costs is kind of all in, how much dispensing fee, ingredient costs is kind of what the whole thing rolls up to, and then the net paid amount is the amount that Humana should be paying to the vendor who supplied the prescription. So those are just cost-related things. Again, internal views for Humana, sometimes how much meds cost and how much the member pays, which is a third version of it, versus how much Humana paid. Sometimes those things are helpful. So again, informational for you as potential predictors, if you will. Are there opioid transactions for patients without their payday supply counts? Intentionally, no, but sometimes data is messy, and that's a real fact of life, so sometimes it wouldn't surprise me if the answer is yes in some cases, but I'm guessing it doesn't happen too frequently. Somebody asked about diagnoses on a medical claim because it just says diagnoses, and are they primary diagnoses? Yes. Tertiary and secondary, because oftentimes claims come with 4 or 5 different diagnoses available on them. No, none of those are just the primary. And then all events related to taking an opioid, absolutely not. Again, we have pharmacy claims and medical claims, inbound call activity are the big categories, but there's lots of pharmacy claims that are not related to opioid in there as well. And obviously medical claims are more about visiting doctors or hospitals, or et cetera. They might be related to a pharmacy claim, but not necessarily always related to a opioid. One point of note, 4 years of data that we have, we've provided you all the activity for that. So each member, on average, I'll say the members have hundreds of activity in that 4-year time period. So yeah, lots of activity, not all opioid related. You have to sift through what's meaningful and what's not. I don't know, Ryan, if you want to start taking these last couple, that would be great. I think you might have to unmute yourself.
Hey, Jeff. Answering questions in the chat. Where did you leave off?
Oh, I'm sorry. I am just on the opioid. This third from the bottom here. If you can see that.
All right. Yeah, great. Our opioid agonists, antagonists, and combinations all considered significant opioids when identifying long-term opioid therapy patients. So any claim that's paid that has an MME associated with it, which is morphine milligram equivalent, we will consider those opioids when we are defining the opioid naive date for long-term opioid therapy and for the subsequent claims in that 180-day time frame.
And I just realized, Ryan, I skipped the one above that. I'm sorry. Probably I'll just cover off on it real fast. It's kind of more of a housekeeping issue. The comp file and the holdout file absolutely contain the absolute same information. Turns out that some of the headers, I guess, on the file in terms of how they were labeled might be a little bit different or spelled differently. Was that intentional? Not necessarily intentional, but again, the underlying data is identical between the two. So you develop a model on the holdout file, on the comp file, and when you apply it to the holdout, you might have to rename some of those fields to match what you had done, but then all the transformations, et cetera, would be accurate. So not something that is unusual in terms of what we have to do in real world data. So that's all I want to say on that one, Ryan.
Okay, great. That second to the bottom, does an action taken by a patient generate several event records at the same time, such as when a patient looks for a medical service and gets some drug under prescription? They can have a paid claim, a new RX drug claim, and a claim paid at the same time. Yeah, that will happen, and it should be tagged as such. So you may see multiple records on the same day, but I think as we've said before, the only thing that is of interest in identifying opioid naive dates is an opioid claim on day 0, and that would be without a opioid prescription being used in the 90 days previous.
Right. The last one, and then we'll keep. I know we have a few more pages, so easy answer. No. If we continue it, maybe again, Ryan, maybe it's easy for you to kind of jump through some of these things because you have the depth and breadth on it.
Oh yeah,
Page
sure.
9.
So task is to predict the long-term opioid therapy after initial prescribing. What's meant by the initial prescribing? What I had just said, opioid naive claims would be defined as a opioid claim being filled without an opioid being taken in the previous 90 days before that claim is filled. And then as far as how we are measuring continuous use and the definition of long-term opioid therapy, we're just interested in the 180 days that initially follow that opioid naive claim date. And I think that question was asked in the chat too. So we keep it simple and say 90% and define that as greater than or equal to 162 of the immediately following 180 days. The qualifying event refer to opioid naive claims only or all opioid claims? It is just opioid naive claim would be the qualifying event, not all opioids. And then can a patient return to opioid naive status once he or she has been using opioids in preceding 90 days? Yes, they can. As long as they have gone 90 days without an opioid each time that happens when they fill an opioid, that event will be tagged as opioid naive. For the period following the opioid naive claim, when we are defining long-term opioid therapy, are we counting supply days? So that is defined as the payday supply count of each claim collected during those 180 days, or is it just the unique days within that 180 days of a member having the opioid available? If a claim is filled towards the end of that 180-day time frame, only days up until day 180 would be counted. All other days that prescription would have been taken won't be counted in that 180-day calculation.
Yeah, this next one probably is on my side because it is kind of within the population, it's the LTOT rate is not very high. We were seeing a 1.04% rate within the population, and that means, but obviously for this competition, we did some sampling and some oversampling to some extent, such that within the comp file and the holdout file, so that's what's referenced with the 14,000 and 6,000, it is a lot higher. So in the comp file, you're going to see an LTOT rate of over 30%, which is a lot different, but it does allow the models to see and figure out a lot more signal, and then also within the holdout file, it is also large. But the only reason we provided you that that population rate was when making recommendations and or saying what is the impact that could be had. It would be false if you were to assume that the file that you were building the models on represented the population. So it allows you to go back to true population percentages if need be when you're making recommendations and or comments. So several people are asking what it was the LTOT rate within the to see if they were, but this gives them a sense if they're getting close to the measure or not in terms of incidence within the comp file. You won't be able to determine it in the holdout file, obviously, because otherwise it wouldn't be a very good test file for us. So. And then the last one also was a metric that was provided on the data dictionary document that was provided, and it just made a statement that within the population there were, each member, the average member had about 1.6 naive opioid claims across that time period. And so, again, just providing some context for you that if you, even though we provide 1 day zero, it behooves you to go look and try to see if there are any subsequent naive opioid claims that happen for that person that you could be leveraging for modeling. So on average, it's about 1.6. If you assume that each member only has one, then that's probably a bad assumption. That's the only reason, again, that was provided to you to provide some population context. And then last ones related to labeling. Again, I'll probably default to you on some of these, Ryan or Derek.
Yeah, I can jump in. This question is kind of referring to something similar earlier. If there is overlap days between two opioid claims, how are those being handled? So if two claims are taken on the same day, that day can only count as a one, so you'd be using the max of that single day and not summing the day supply counts of both of the claims.
Yep. And yeah, again, the next one is really just related to, again, the kickoff slide said every individual on the file has at least one set to day zero, but there might be some records that have nothing on them. Well, that, again, 14 records out of the total number. Dirty data happens at times, and you all have to figure out what that is and clean that up. We certainly didn't promise clean data, so that's an instance of probably some of that coming up on you. And similarly, when somebody says in the holdout file, same thing, you might not be able to score every record within the holdout file. However, there are 6,000 records in the holdout file. We want to get all 6,000 back, and regardless of whether you can score it or not. So that's important to, if you return a record that you weren't able to score, for instance, that's fine. Just make the probability and the rank missing, and we can deal with that, because it's going to help us understand as well about accuracy. So thank you very much. And then again, I think the next one was something, if we had included actual dates of service instead of going with the anchor date thought. And again, we had to do this with the anchor date for privacy and compliance issues. But if you were then looking back into 2015 as an exclusion would just be to help identify those claims that might have happened very early in 2016 in the look back window of 90 days to say, is this a opioid naive claim, yes or no, and you might have had to spill into 15. But given the fact that we created the anchor date and that metric that allows you to know the number of days since the last, you don't have to worry about 15 or 16 or anything like that. So that kind of was a legacy statement that we probably could have removed. You don't have to worry too much about it. Oops, sorry, I switched. And then I guess the last one is, or not the last one, but the second to last one is, again, just reiterating, and you can read it in detail later. But it is really just going and saying this, an example of a person who might have had 3 different opioid prescriptions, and should they all be considered for as potentially naive opioid and considered for qualifying, or just the first one? And obviously, back to things that we've said a couple times already, it is very possible that a person has multiple, and if they do have multiple that meet all the criteria, then you should probably pay attention to all 3 of them. And then again, the last one on this labeling and or identification, probably more within the holdout file. Again, we're looking for probabilities. We're not looking for yes or no, LTOT yes or no, kind of, or a binary answer from you at the end of the day, because we're going to be using ROC, AUC as our metric, so specificity, and we don't want you to have to worry about what is the cutoff that you're going to end up using, and using that as a that's really not what we're. So the probability is what we really want from you. So again, when you return the file and we ask for the middle component, which is the actual predicted score, make sure it's kind of a number ranging between 0 and 1, and not 1 or 0, only 1 or 0. So then we're getting close to the end of these general. The last category here, general questions. How do we know how many days of opioid therapy the patient used? Oh, that came up a lot. Obviously, we're all the things that we're looking at are prescriptions that get filled. We don't actually know how the patients and or members actually take their medications, or if they take their medications. So that's not something that we know. We infer and hope, I suppose, that they're compliant with taking their meds as they're supposed to, but it's not something that we can observe or know. So we're basing everything based off of prescription and scripts as written. So. Let's see if any of these others are. Before I know we're getting close on time, so I want to open it up for maybe broader questions that are coming through on chat or the Q&A. Karen?
Yes. Yep. Jeff, can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Okay.
So did you want us to, I'm not sure if it's best for you guys probably to look at them on your end to know which questions are ones that maybe have already been answered. So if you can view the chat, maybe. I mean, I'm saving them, but.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not. Let me do one thing before we do that, and then I can stop presenting this and start looking at the chat itself. But again, I just want to make sure, and again, this deck will be available for folks on the web, but have to reiterate final submissions, what is due, when it's due, and the appropriate formats. Mentioned this already. 15th, two things: scored file, the scored holdout file, CSV, 3 fields. The written submission also, that's either in a Word or PDF. Those are what's due on October 15th. The presentation format, that's due, obviously, for November 14th. If you make the top 5 only is required, so that's not due on the 15th. Of October. And then obviously this is a format that we want the scored file and the written submission to be in. Again, please understand that all judging when we get to round 2 is blinded. So we don't want any references to your university or to anybody on your specific team. We don't want that at all in any of the submission information. So just make sure that this title is about, for your captain, is about the only way that one could ever understand or link it to your particular team. That's that. And then let's see, questions again. That's all I wanted to say. But go ahead.
I was going to let you know, I emailed you a copy of the questions that I've copied out of the chat, so that may be an easier way for you to pull them up and see them all in one place.
Sure. Let me, I'm going to stop sharing this then so I can go do something else without disrupting the whole call.
Hey, Jeff, a common question I'm seeing in the chat is about the prescriber specialties.
Okay.
So participants, you can assume that specialty, the first one without a number, is the primary, and secondary and tertiary. You can assume they're ordered. Whether or not you want to, that will improve your score, that's something that you're going to have to determine on your own.
So it's a specialty of the provider who's writing the script, correct?
Yes.
Are there others that you see in the chat, comment that you want to just reach out to and speak to, Derek?
I think we covered a lot of them already throughout the call. There are some questions about how to identify if a drug is an opioid or not an opioid and related things. The easiest thing for you to do is to look for that morphine milligram equivalent field, and those are the opioids that we're interested in, like Ryan discussed earlier. So I would revisit what he stated.
So I do see a couple things when we're talking about within the context of paid claims, and it'll say new diagnosis, for instance, and there'll be new diagnosis top 5, or a new diagnosis CPD or CAD or CHF. Those are top 5 is just referring to the fact that they have a new diagnosis within one of the top 5 medical conditions that chronic medical conditions that we at Humana pay a lot of attention to. And then you see those actually 5 listed separately even, so you would know which particular one it was. So acronyms are abound, of course. So you end up seeing, COPD or congestive heart failure, diabetes, etc. So those are often the 5 that are listed. But again, in many cases, I would say research is your friend, and lots of things can be found out from a terminology perspective online. One other point of note, I'll say with the holdout file, again, you're doing the scoring of that holdout file and providing us the file itself with the subsequent scores or resultant scores. The actual scoring code, well, we do not need with your submission. If, for instance, all of a sudden your submission, becomes the star of the show, then obviously and implementation going forward, etc., scoring code would probably be wanted from you, but from currently from a submission not required. So you can keep that for now, and then obviously, if need be and when, then Humana will come knocking for that code. But we're not looking to dig through code in any way, shape, or form in the context of this competition. Any others that you see good and worthwhile answering? There's a lot of questions. Again, we'll kind of sort through them, and I think we've answered some as we've gone through the hour.
Jeff, did we answer the length of the report?
Yeah, no, not specifically. Again, it's what you, there's no prescription to that. It's I'll say successful ones in the past have been long enough such that it was clear about what they did, how they did some of the important analysis and kind of feature creation or dealt with trouble within the data. But again, it spent an equal amount of time on what does the results mean, how could they be used, and recommendations. So you have to balance conveying enough information, but being concise and keeping the reader and judges interested. So that's, again, not prescriptive. I will tell you, if you are probably over, 25 pages or so, you probably need to cull it down a bit. So, again, it has to be something that people can read and digest, but still convey the right amount of information. If you're 2 pages, you're not going to be able to do that. So.
And I just want to reiterate that we have been pulling all the questions from the chat. So when this call is over, since we just have a limited time, we will sift through the questions. So anything, of course, that was answered, you saw on the slides, will be shared. Anything that was answered from our Q&A section, we will put into written form and put on the website for you as well. So if we didn't get to your question, or it's a repeat question, you just want to go back and review, it will be up on the website once we get it in written form.
Right. And it's important to remember that there's a lot of themes to the questions. So again, I'll stress that verbatims might not be out there, but if there's a lot of questions related to, which there were, for instance, related to what's the difference between payday supply, payable quantity. Okay, that was addressed. So there are themes that we'll make sure get answered. So that's how we're grouping them and answering questions. So again, you're welcome to submit questions throughout the course as we go. And again, we'll be compiling them and sending out answers twice a week, starting next week. First time we'll be dumping them out there on Tuesday, and then again next Friday, and then Tuesday, Friday. That will be the schedule for questions to be answered. So hopefully this has been helpful for folks. Again, there's a lot. I know a lot of information to digest, and you're getting kind of data cold. So we're trying to be as accommodating as possible, but also not prescriptive in terms of what gets done or how it gets done. So that's what we've got for you today. Thanks for your participation. Again, we chose this format this time as a very one-way discussion with questions, just because of the potential for lots of distraction and sound if we allowed mics on the attendees side, which we ran into last time. So this is what we chose. Again, we'll do everything we can to address reasonable questions going forward. Thanks for your time and energy, and really good luck. As you saw, there's a large pool of folks out there, so do your best work. And we definitely look forward, as from Humana and Texas A&M's perspective, to see what people come up with, because this is exciting times for us. So thanks a lot. Look forward to hearing from you all over the course of the next couple weeks through the Q&A.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yep. Take care.
Bye-bye.